Welcome, Sarah Morris. And before we start, I need to welcome two other artists we are going to work with and open 2 shows in the very near future here at Kunsthalle Wien. Welcome, Babette Mangold. Babette's show we are going to open next week, Saturday, at the Lower Gallery, and I'm also very pleased to welcome Camille Henrault. Her show we are going to open at Kunsthalle Wien Karlsplatz in March. Sarah and me, and we don't want to be too anecdotal at all. We have 2 different kinds of relationships, and relationships are very important for our job life and how we proceeded in our different careers, but there were a lot of connections in the time. We met before we were working together 25 years ago in the back seat of a taxi, and we a bit drunk, I guess. Huh? So it was.
Well,
we were very young.
Yeah, we were arguing about whether it was in New York
or in San Francisco.
I think in San Francisco, actually.
I think it's New York.
I think it was in San Francisco, but
it's okay. But it's I remember because it was one of my trips to the US. And it was the same trip where I traveled in between, but for a couple of months. Okay.
But you visited the studio.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember
on
that.
42nd Street.
Mm-hmm.
Putting those anecdotal things apart, I remember quite a lot of shows we were working on together, but my most beloved shows were the possibility of the impossible. It was an exhibition about on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Adorno's death in Frankfurt, a show I created together with my colleague Vanessa Joan Müller, and in 2003. And really, I think you did great there, also in designing the logo. I don't know if you remember this. And on another occasion, it was the exhibition, the biennial Truth, at the Media City Soul Festival in 2010. We decided also that we are not giving, this shouldn't be a classical speech tonight. We thought that we are playing a little bit with not with Q&As, but with questioning, or from my side, questioning Sarah about her practice. And she doesn't know the questions. We realized that she's always, you said that, I'm sorry, I have to say it, that you're even better when not prepared.
Yeah.
And everything what we are talking about tonight, about her work, it's very well prepared and very much under control. You have a background in political philosophy. What triggered you to become engaged with art, and how do your university studies still inform your practice as an artist?
Say that one more time.
You have a background in political philosophy. What triggered you to become engaged with art? I think that's the most important.
Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question to answer, the causality of making a decision like that. But I think I was surrounded, my parents were in science, so it definitely wasn't my parents, but I had several grandmothers that were painters. So that was one thing that was always in the background, sort of on a sort of hobby amateur level, but very good. And I was aware of their work. But I think it was really probably when I was at Brown, and then I was at Cambridge, and I was studying. There was a lot of people around me, particularly at Brown, who were making film. There was Todd Haynes and Christine Vachon, who were ahead of me by 4 or 5 years, but they were very successful making film in America and independent cinema. So if you went into production, it would be towards film. Now this, as a student, I had no money to be making films. I was in other people's films, but I never made any films when I was at Brown. But I was aware of this idea of going into some form of being an artist or an author. And I suppose there was one point where I read a lot, and I came into contact with a lot of different material. Probably one of them was a really great issue of October magazine on Broodtars that I think I stole out of the library. And there's many different reasons why you become an artist, but probably it was a combination of deciding that I had read enough, and I was sort of sick of reading, and I was interested in having a sort of dialogue. And I think this is about as close as it gets to having that type of dialogue and that conversation with an audience.
When you said that you didn't have any money to produce a film, the very beginning was painting, and you were not only painting in the very beginning, the late 1980s, beginning 1990s.
Well, when I said I didn't have money to make a film, that was like as a student, and I wasn't making art either. I wasn't making anything. I was just reading. Okay,
but you do both, and there is a relationship between both of your body of works, the paintings and your films. In which way are painting and film connected for you? I think this is what I always get asked. When we decided working together on this show, and also my team asked me immediately, how does that belong together?
Well, it's not really two bodies of work, first of all. It's one body of work.
It's both film.
It could be the work of two different people on the worst day, but it's one body of work, and I see it as like cohesive, the same way you have a right hand and a left hand. And actually, I am ambidextrous. But anyhow, yeah, I see it as like two sides of the same coin. The films are very fast. They're quite expensive in relation to making paintings. They're very cooperative, collaborative. They involve hundreds of conversations, discussions about logistics, everything from the weather to vans and getting around a city and making things possible and getting into rooms, having access. So the films are very fast-paced and they involve a lot of adrenaline. The paintings, on the other hand, are very systemic, very slow, almost on the verge of monotonous, but both have this element of starting off with a coordinate, starting off with this idea of being part of something that is larger than you, a system that is larger than you, and where do you start that initial point, and being aware of these institutions, these powers that be, whether you call them a grid, whether you call them a luxury brand, whether you call them a government, it doesn't really matter to me. They're all part of the idea that you're part of, that there is no outside, that there is no place to be that is outside this grid. Yeah.
It's definitely not a one-trick pony.
It's definitely not a what?
A one. I come back to this later, okay. But most of your works depict from the architecture of cities or particular urban environments.
I use architecture, which is different than it being about cities. I was texting somebody earlier today about this. Like, I really don't see the films as being. Of course, they are. If you went on just a structuralist level, yes, they're a series of cities.
Honestly,
that are connected.
We probably have the privilege of visiting all those cities. But when you watch those films and have never been visiting, let's say
they
Beijing,
can function like that. Of course,
they function like that.
Yeah.
In a very analytical way. I think so, not just as a city guide. Many of your works can be seen as portraits, I think. How can places, considering their incorporations of history and aspects of power, and power plays also a very important role in your works, tell something about the underlying social fabric?
What was the question, though?
Are you interested?
It sounded like
indirectly,
a statement.
Indirectly, you answered it. Yeah. So it's already. But it's. Are you interested in the social fabric of a specific place?
Well, I mean, I've thought of this before when you talk about the idea of the cities or the films being able to be used perhaps as something else, like you could use it if you didn't know the map of New York, or you could use it as a guide to like the 90s in New York, or so on and so forth. I mean, there are a lot of ways to approach the films, but of course I do view, I mean, there's hundreds of characters, hundreds of people in the films, ranging from the anonymous to, of course, the very well-known. There's a spectrum, as there is with the architecture itself. Yeah, I mean, you might have a 7-Eleven, you might have a AM, PM sort of convenience shop, and you might have the White House. You might have Watergate, and the symbol that is, and then you might also have sort of a building that sort of means something, it's just sort of a bastardization of some sort of Mies van der Rohe concept of America. It doesn't matter to me. On that spectrum, what's important is to have this sort of non-hierarchical slice, horizontal slice.
But going a little bit back, and when you think about making it, how do you select the point of departure of your works?
Well, the point of departure is really usually very easy. It's usually deciding what to do after the point of departure. The point of departure, like, when I was making the Beijing series of paintings, and I was working on this idea for a film to make, because a lot of it is about placing myself in a certain situation. Not just myself, but the idea of the role of the artist. Yeah, so if I think to myself, like, I want to be in the cabinet room of the White House, or I want to be in the bird's nest, or in the Olympic Games on the opening night of the rehearsals in China, I think about, like, first is like this sort of ultimate sort of inner point of that access, and then it sort of devolves from there.
Sarah is talking about two different films, about Capital.
Which you're showing, right?
Yeah, which we are showing here in our program, and Beijing. Both films will be screened here. Yeah. How do you? I always, this question is. It works like, for me, it works like this: that I always try to answer them, and when I'm insecure of the answer, I think I should question it. Okay. How do you usually develop your works? Do you have a fixed image in mind?
I don't have any fixed image in mind, really. It's funny because I think the work looks like it would be very planned and very, obviously there's a meticulousness to the production of the work, but actually there's so much that's improvised. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's improvised in the film. The locations are fixed, like Eiffel Tower, Bois de Boulogne, whatnot. But did we know that there was going to be a girl in a bear suit in the Bois de Boulogne walking around? No, we did not. That just happened. And then once it happened, I was like, I'm going to film that. So there's a walk between the planned event, like the Olympics, and the unplanned.
Is this what you mean? It leads me to my next question. Do you you described once your paintings and films as open forms? Is this what you mean with open forms?
I mean, no. What I meant it more like the way sort of Umberto Eco talks about texts being open, meaning that they can be used later on many different levels. They can be read as many different types of narrative. One we're talking about is possibly just one. But yes, you can look at it as a portrait of a city, you could look at it as a portrait of a presidency, or you could look at it as like a post-Watergate look at all surfaces mean nothing because you can't trust them. I mean, there's many ways to read the images, both paintings and in the films. That's what I meant by open.
At the very moment, we only can see, we see one image and one painting. Yeah. You are and I think this is probably for me the most important in reading your both films and paintings. You are an observer of political, social and economic structures, of systems of control. Can you remove yourself from these systems, or is there Or is there any other connection?
Can I remove myself from these systems?
Yes.
No, because we're all part of these systems. Yeah? I mean...
Who keeps control about those systems which you are portraying?
Well, I mean, that's debatable. I certainly don't think... I mean, I think one thing for sure that, you know, post-2008 has sort of taught us, not only as artists, but also just as citizens, of course, is that these structures that are supposedly fixed, whether they're banks, governments, corporations, whatnot, they're not fixed at all. They can very easily disappear. Yeah, they can very easily emerge. They can very easily disappear. That's what we're seeing right now going on in various countries, but that these things are not fixed at all. So I think by this sort of series of appropriations, yeah, which is sort of like a little bit monopolistic, yeah, I mean, ultimately this conversation about power and about the sort of fluidity of power and how it's sort of shaping, where does it reside at the time? That's a conversation that artists are having.
Yeah, probably the role of the artist and our recent society has never been more relevant, I think, but that would be a whole other conversation. But it's still, how should artists deal with the complicity and structures of injustice?
Well, I think you have to point out and question these things, whatever situation you're in, and obviously don't take these situations very seriously because they are crumbling. Some of them actually are very interesting and can do interesting things, but I think, you know, I remember when I was researching the Capitol film, part of the research was to crash a party that Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton were at. They were fundraising so that she could become a senator. And I went to the party, and it was a small party, like, I don't know, 70 people. And he gave a speech, she gave a speech, he gave a speech. And his speech was all about how at the end of the 60s, everybody took it for granted, the vocabulary, the dynamic, the atmosphere, the feeling, and then suddenly there was Richard Nixon, yeah? And he was trying to say that you can't take these things for granted. You know, you can't take power or even vocabulary or even a discourse for granted. These things can change very, very quickly, so you have to try to be in control of them. But you also have to recognize at the same time that these are fluid things.
Going a little bit back and talking a little bit more specific about all of your films, we are going to show in the next weeks 9 of your films. How many have you done altogether? It's
13 or 14.
13 or 14, it means
yeah.
it's a...
I mean, I'm working on a new one now, so
yes,
if I count that one, maybe.
This we know.
14.
So, yeah, no, it's you know, that means a pretty big package of your oeuvre we are showing here, and I think it's the selection we made fits very well together. But the production of some of your films, like Beijing and Capital, required access to places that are usually closed to the public.
You know, I just thought of something sort of funny, because you were talking about this morning, this idea of like the commission film, and you know, the level of possible potential compromise that the artist is in and whatnot. One thing that is funny with my films is I've always had this happen at various moments, like even after I made Beijing or I made Capital, some people would think that these are commissioned films.
No, I haven't thought...
Yeah, so I would always have to say no, that actually that was just my agenda.
How should Bill Clinton in its time, when he still was in charge, commissioned you to do a film about him? But anyway, especially the Olympics in Beijing and the White House during the Clinton time, how did you have gatekeepers to those institutions or not?
I mean, there are always gatekeepers. I mean, there was a collector from DC that I knew from, not that I knew, but I knew of, from New York, who I knew had bought some of my work. and I knew he was very interested, but I had never met him, and so I think I flew from London to Washington, D.C. to meet him, to talk to him about this film, and he was a lobbyist, lawyer, and the brother of him was Bill Clinton's chief of staff. But even then, when I would tell him my list of coordinates and places I would be, he would talk in percentages, he would talk in statistics. So if I would say cabinet room of the White House, he would say 10%. And if I would say the Pentagon, he'd be like 20%, and so on and so forth. He was pretty, I mean, he was very realistic about how, what my chances were to get in. But in the end, that is, I mean, talking about like an open text, I mean, probably when Clinton was in office, you know, they weren't interested in policing what it was I was doing. Once I was vouched for, it was okay for me to have a camera in the cabinet room. They never contacted me afterwards and policed it at all. They were very trusting in terms of what I was up to. But
in the end of the day, how did they deal with you? Were they interested in it, what you were doing?
Yeah, I was asked a couple of times to speak to that foundation, yeah. I didn't do it, but I was asked.
Once you have said that your films are about conspiracies, what makes it a conspiracy for you?
Well, I probably mean by that, if I said that, which I trust you, that I said that, I probably meant that, you know, looking at surfaces, which is what I do all the time and what we do, yeah, for a living. Looking at surfaces, I'm always trying to look past the surface. Yeah, the surface is interesting. It's interesting why somebody made the decisions they made, how the news is put together, or how this building looks, or how this sign is functioning, and so on and so forth. But I mean, the real thing that's interesting is like the decisions behind the surface, yeah? And also, one has to be wary of these decisions and surfaces in general, because we know that this is not to be trusted.
Coming to the core of this exhibition, Strange Magic, this is what we said in the press release, and you slightly disagree, is a representation of contemporary France.
Yeah, I don't think it's about a representation of contemporary France, but you can say that.
As well as a portrait of the material wealth that is accumulated by luxury industries like ... The film plays on the representation of power through architecture. Strange Magic was commissioned by LVMH. And we decided, we decided that I'm not always, it's not only about them, it could be also another company. Is that right? Theoretically or not?
Yeah, but I don't know if I would have said yes to another company. I mean, they are, well, first of all, Suzanne Paget is the director of LVMH's foundation and museum, and I had a history of working with her, so she came to me and asked me, would I be interested in making a new film? And she said it could be about whatever I wanted it to be, but she said, you know, it should start from the diving board of the fact that they're making a museum and that they're sort of going into, I wasn't familiar with the foundation at all before, so I wasn't, you know, aware of what they had done or what they hadn't done. All I knew is that they were commissioning Frank Gehry to make a new building in the Bois de Boulogne. So this is like public space being appropriated by a private company. I mean, how the hell do you get that done, right? In the middle of one of the best cities, you know, one of the most major cities in the world. And that's a feat. And of course, I'm familiar with that. When you mentioned this 42nd Street studio I had, which was right between 7th and 8th Avenue in the best real estate of Manhattan, really, I always think of that film, Sweet Smell of Success. But anyhow, you have, you know, that block was developed by Disney and given free by the city of New York to Disney, free for 100 years lease, free. Yeah. So these deals are made between public and private all the time. So anyway, this interested me too, the fact that it was a new museum in public space by a private entity. Already this was like very complicated and very problematic. Yeah.
And this relationship is very, very different in Europe than in the US.
Well, but it's, I mean, come on, they occupy space in a public park.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
But again, in
You mean they're more in bed?
They're more in, you know, public.
Okay.
Public spaces are occupied by private entities in the US.
But anyway, this idea of this compromised space, because already, like we're talking about this museum, it's like this is very compromised situation, yeah? This is not something, I think, I mean, a lot of people perhaps would be like, I'm not going to get involved or I'm not going to do it, but actually this is the very type of compromised situation that I think is like the subject matter of my work. So I said yes. For another company, I don't know whether I would have said yes or no, but obviously they're playing with very big stakes.
LVMH is the ultimate symbol of opulence and wealth. What is your interest in the construct of LVMH?
You love saying that.
Yeah.
What is my interest in it?
Should
I don't really have an
say
interest.
Louis Vuitton?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. What is my interest in them?
Yes.
I'm not really interested in them per se. I think I'm interested in the type of sort of Citizen Kane type ego of doing this type of conglomeration of all of these different types of things, like champagne, which is like organic chemistry, yeah? Taking the best of champagne, taking the best of perfume, taking the best, I mean, he even owns part of the Eiffel Tower, you know, like this thing of like the amalgamation of all of these things is a form of propaganda that actually is beyond, it's beyond the idea of luxury. It's nationalist. Yeah,
it's
too.
Pretty much nationalist, but are you interested in dismantling their strategies in manipulation?
Am I what?
Manipulation. Those companies manipulate our taste.
I'm interested in the intelligence of why this and not that, and why, you know.
Can an artist learn from their strategies?
Yeah, of course. I think artists can learn from anything. I think it's an interesting question of whether, I mean, I try as an artist to make it very clear that like politics is fair game, business is fair game, the law is fair game, entertainment, you know, all of these things, they're not just fair game as subject matters of the work, because they are, of course, subject matters of the work, they're the titles of the various paintings, and they're the coordinates that start everything, the ball rolling. But I think, of course, these fields, architecture, law, entertainment, politics, they involve strategies that maybe artists should learn from. I definitely think it's better to combine these forces than to think that art is completely separate. I don't believe art is completely separate.
Me not either. This is almost the perfect passage to go over to the film. Mm-hmm. But the title of your exhibition, Falls Never Breaks, poses a riddle that can be answered with night. Or what does it mean exactly?
Falls Never Break. Oh, Falls Never Breaks was just, for me, well, of course it's a psychological state, but it was also a nickname given to a friend of mine who would always get into situations and somehow always come out unscathed. Okay. Yeah, and I sort of liked that nickname.
Which version do we see now?
There's only one version. I don't know what you're talking about.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, bye.